My name is Miriam Westfield. I'm 41 years old, and I serve as a commander in the United States Navy specializing in strategic linguistic operations. I speak Arabic like a native because sometimes knowing when not to translate is what saves lives. I've spent my career behind closed doors, negotiating in whispers, decoding the pauses between words, and guiding operations through hostile terrain, using nothing more than a headset and a voice kept steady under pressure. I've been in war rooms without windows. I've been the last voice a kidnapped officer heard before they were rescued. But that night at the embassy gala, none of that mattered. To my father, I was just a daughter in a black dress. And to the crowd, I was invisible. The room glowed in amber light. Crystal chandeliers flickered over polished uniforms and foreign dignitaries. A string quartet played something soft and pretentious. Waiters glided through the marble hall with trays of champagne and sea salt tartlets. My heels clicked against the floor as I moved through a place where every smile felt rehearsed, every glance like a test. I had barely finished greeting the French defense attaché when my father appeared broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, wearing the same Medal of Valor pin he wore to every event since his retirement from the SEALs. A hero to many, a stranger to me. He smiled for the room, not for me. Then, loud enough for half the table to hear, he leaned in and said, "You're just a translator, Miriam. Don't speak." There was a pause, not from me but from the air. Something in my throat sank, but my face didn't move. I had learned from him after all. I turned toward the head table, trying to breathe through it. That's when I saw it. A hand, a napkin shift, a glass adjusted. Nothing dramatic. Just enough for someone trained to see silence to notice it screamed. The foreign ambassador's champagne had just been swapped. I didn't hesitate. I moved toward him slowly, like I was just making another round of greetings. He raised his glass with a polite smile, and then gently, barely audible, I leaned near and spoke in Arabic. "Do not drink that. Something is wrong." He didn't look at me. He didn't react like someone surprised. He just paused. And then his fingers moved, brushing his lapel. A signal. One only a few people would recognize. A Gulf region field sign for, "I've been compromised, but I understand. Proceed." And then he drank. The moment lasted 10 heartbeats, maybe 12. He set the glass down, nodded at the toast that followed. Then his eyes glazed, his knees buckled, and the ambassador collapsed onto the white linen tablecloth, his glass rolling off the table and shattering. A shriek. Gasps. Chairs scraped against marble. I froze, not out of fear, but because my father was smiling, not confused, not shocked, smiling. It was small, brief, but I know what a victory twitch looks like. And in that flicker of a smile, I saw something I hadn't dared believe before. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. Something much darker had just been exposed, and I was the only one in that ballroom who knew it. I used to think I understood my father. Rear Admiral Ronald Westfield Rhett. A decorated SEAL commander, a war hero, the man with the kind of discipline that cracked like gunfire, and the presence to silence a room with a look. He had led men through burning wreckage, pulled bodies from rivers, and survived ambushes where others never returned. But that night, that smirk, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Cruelty doesn't always arrive with a weapon in hand. Sometimes it wears a tuxedo and blends in. The man who taught me how to control my voice during interrogation humiliated me at a diplomatic gala. The same man who told me you don't win wars with words never knew that words were the very reason 6 American soldiers walked out of a rebel compound in Yemen alive. He had no idea that I'd stood in a satellite-linked safe house in Muscat, whispering lines of dialogue to a translator who froze mid-negotiation. That the entire mission turned when I took the headset and spoke to the tribal commander in his mother's dialect, disarming a potential bloodbath with 4 words. No one clapped. There were no medals, just silence, and the knowledge that lives had been saved by precision and patience. But my father had always wanted something louder from me. He didn't understand quiet power. He didn't respect fluency unless it came with firepower. So when I spoke that night at the gala, not to him but to the ambassador, and when that whisper carried more weight than all the suits in that room, he wasn't just threatened, he was offended. Because I did something he didn't understand. I saw the threat before the others. I read the signal. I intervened without force. And when the ambassador collapsed, he knew immediately what I had done. He also knew I'd ruined something. But what? That was the question that clung to me in the hours after. Why would my father smile? Why did he speak to no one as the medics arrived? Why did he disappear before the investigation began? And why, when I checked the guest list the next morning, was his name not registered with the embassy at all? That night had never been just a gala. It had been a stage. And the toast wasn't a celebration. It was a test. But if I'd passed it, what had he failed? The truth I feared was bigger than pride or family history. Something had shifted. And I was no longer just the daughter of a war hero. I was now the only person who had seen the shadow behind the salute, the only person who spoke the language and understood the silence between the words. My name is Miriam Westfield. I'm 41 years old, a commander in the United States Navy. My specialty is strategic linguistic intelligence, Arabic to be specific. Classical Levantine Gulf, North African dialects. I learned it not from textbooks, but from walking markets in Amman and eavesdropping on arguments between imams in Al-Mahra. I speak it like I was born into it. I listen like I'm always being tested. But in most rooms, I'm invisible. People see the uniform and assume admin. They hear linguist and think translator. They assume I'm just here to whisper into a colonel's earpiece or scribble notes for someone more important. But the truth is, my work doesn't follow anyone. It leads, quietly. I'm not the face of press conferences. I don't brief the president on camera. I'm not in the photos of diplomatic handshakes that make the front page. I'm the reason those meetings happen without falling apart. I'm the sentence between sentences. I'm the pause after the question that tells you who's lying and who's playing for time. But to my father, that's meaningless. Rear Admiral Ronald Westfield retired. Silver Star, Bronze Star, and enough SEAL deployments to fill a novel. To most of the military world, he's the walking definition of valor. To me, he's the man who taught me everything about how to survive war, but nothing about how to survive a father who never believed I was enough. I grew up in the shadow of his stories. He filled the house with tales of jungle extractions, hostage rescues, the kind of missions that made the front page of the Stars and Stripes. He never raised his voice at me, not once. But the silence was louder. It was in the way he looked past me at dinner when I mentioned my language certifications. It was in how he left the room during my ROTC Scholarship Award speech. It was in every good for you that landed like a pat on the head instead of a handshake. He didn't yell. He dismissed. And that's a harder wound to stitch up. I didn't become a Navy officer to prove him wrong. At least not at first. I joined because I believed words could move things, borders, minds, lives. I believed in diplomacy backed by precision. I believed that being fluent in a region's language made you responsible for more than just translation. It made you a bridge. But at home, none of that seemed to register. When I got assigned to CENTCOM for a 6-month rotation in Qatar, my father's only comment was, "Don't let them keep you in the back room." Pushed to be at the real table. He said it like I hadn't already been running field debriefs for 2 years by then. Like I hadn't spent 47 hours straight managing a high-stakes negotiation between 2 tribal factions, who both thought the other was rigging the medical supply routes. Like I hadn't already earned my seat at the table 10 times over, but still I smiled. Because daughters do that. We smile while bleeding. The hardest part wasn't that he didn't see me. It was that he didn't want to. Not as I was. He wanted a version of me that matched his reflection, loud, visible, unmistakably masculine in energy and dominance. He wanted me to charge in boots down, claim the space like he did. But that's never been me. I don't storm, I observe. I let people underestimate me because it gives me time to watch. I let others speak first because it gives me power over the silence. I collect details like weapons. I dismantle lies with syntax. I once got a Syrian general to admit to violating a ceasefire agreement by intentionally misusing a term in classical Arabic. He assumed I wouldn't catch. I caught it. He went pale. I didn't even raise my voice. And afterward, the colonel next to me said, "You didn't just translate. You disarmed him." And I did. Without ever picking up a weapon. But those are stories I never told at home. Because at home, success had to be loud. It had to be physical. It had to bleed or sweat to count. My mother once said before she passed, you and your father are too much alike in all the wrong ways. And I think that's why we clashed. Because we both read the room. But he commanded it. I decoded it. He was always the hammer. I was the scalpel. But hammers don't value scalpels until something delicate needs saving. And that's the irony. For all his obsession with control, my father never saw what real control looked like. It wasn't in barking orders or breaking doors down. It was in the way a single whisper in the right language at the right moment could undo an entire operation, or save it. He never asked about the operations I ran, never once read the commendation letters I left on the kitchen counter during visits. He probably thought they were memos, and I never corrected him. Because some part of me still wanted him to ask. And when he didn't, I let the silence grow teeth. And yet, when the invitation came for the embassy gala, I thought maybe, just maybe, things could shift. The email arrived with a gold seal. My name was listed by Title Commander Merriam Westfield. I was invited for my contribution to regional stability via non-combat operations. I'd been named in 3 international task force commendations that year alone. It was the kind of event where presence was acknowledgement, where being seen meant something. So I said yes, not for the spotlight, not even for the dress. I said yes because I wanted to walk into a room where my work was recognized, maybe not by the world, but at least by my father, just once. But what I didn't know then was that the embassy gala wasn't about honor. It wasn't about diplomacy. It was a game board. And I wasn't a guest. I was a pawn. And the man I thought I understood, the man I still called Dad in private, wasn't just attending the game. He was playing it. And I was about to realize just how far he was willing to go to win. When I was 12, I tried to impress my father by translating a full-page editorial from Al-Quds Al-Arabi about regional instability in the Gulf. I handed him the notebook with every line, written in careful English, proud of my accuracy, of how I had captured nuance and idioms no one had taught me in school. He read 2 lines, set it down without a word, and muttered, "These words won't save anyone's life." That stayed with me longer than any childhood punishment ever could. I'd been fluent in Arabic since I was 9, not because anyone made me, but because I wanted to understand something my father couldn't. It wasn't rebellion, it was curiosity, purpose. I believed if I could speak the languages of conflict, I could one day interrupt it. But to him, language wasn't a weapon, not a real one, not one that carried weight like a rifle or a kill code. He wanted a daughter who trained for direct action, not dialogue. By 16, I'd stopped telling him when I won language competitions. By 18, I didn't mention I'd been recruited by the Naval Academy's Language Immersion Initiative. By 25, I'd completed my 2nd tour supporting Naval Special Warfare Command in cross-border operations. And he still hadn't asked what I actually did. He didn't say he was disappointed. He didn't have to. He just kept calling me our little translator at family gatherings. He made it sound cute, harmless. As if my presence in intelligence briefings, my field reports, my contributions to 3 recovered hostages in Beirut were all somehow just a side hobby. Like I'd never truly stood in the fire. I remember the day I got my commendation from the Secretary of Defense. My team had decrypted and restructured a tribal communication map in northwest Yemen that ultimately saved 2 Marines caught in a wrong-turn ambush. I called my father that evening. He didn't pick up. The next morning, I got a text, "Congrats. Just remember to keep your head cool. This stuff fades fast." There it was again, that careful dismissal dressed up as advice. Like excellence only counted if it came with blood in the sand or medals earned through brute force. But what he never understood was, my work was surgical. It was invisible by design. Because when you're doing it right, no one knows you were even there. And maybe that was what hurt the most. Not the lack of praise, but the complete absence of interest. He didn't ask how I'd pulled off that operation. He didn't ask what it felt like to hear a hostage's breath catch when I delivered the extraction code in Arabic. He never once asked how I slept after translating threats from men who didn't know I was listening. He wanted me to carry a rifle. I carried voices. When I was invited to give a closed-door briefing at the Pentagon, one I was told had directly influenced policy around civil liaison operations in Northern Africa, I emailed him a picture of the pass with the word, "Thought you'd be proud." He replied the next day, "Don't let them box you into clerical work. Push for the field. Clerical work." I sat in my car after reading that in the parking lot, outside joint base, Anacostia, gripping the wheel until the rubber squeaked under my palms. Because I knew he would never see me the way I had hoped. He wasn't built to recognize quiet resilience. To him, if it didn't leave a scar, it didn't count. I had scars, but they weren't the kind you could show. They lived under my skin, in the silence between his words, in the pauses after I told him something that meant everything to me and got nothing in return. They say time heals. I don't believe that. Time just teaches you how to carry things quieter. I stopped sending him updates. I stopped expecting anything, but sometimes when I'd finish a mission when the debriefs were done and the tapes were archived, when I'd be sitting alone in the dark outside some embassy compound or listening post, I'd think about that 12-year-old version of me, holding a notebook full of careful words, waiting for a father who would never read past the second line. That version of me still burned quietly in the corners of my memory, not from pain, but from clarity. Because you learn eventually that not all wounds need bandages. Some just need boundaries. And that's what I had now. I didn't need him to cheer for me. I didn't need his permission, but I still hoped in some small leftover part of me that he would look at me one day and see the woman I had become. Not in his image, but in my own. That's why I went to the embassy gala, not to prove anything, not even to confront him, just to stand in a room he respected, in a uniform he once wore, and exist, without apology, without explanation, and maybe to see if he'd finally see me. But instead he looked at me, smirked, and said, "You're just a translator. Don't speak." And in that moment I knew he never would. 1 week before the embassy gala, I received an encrypted message through my classified comms line. The sender was a field contact in the Defense Intelligence Agency, someone I'd worked with during a cross-border operation in Lebanon the year prior. No subject line, no salutation, just 3 lines. New funds moving through shell groups. Names overlap with a domestic contractor. Possible proxy destabilization effort. One name might interest you. Attached was a fragment of a funding ledger scrubbed but not enough. I decrypted it in minutes. One of the shell companies being used to launder money from a Gulf-based consulting network into domestic operations was called Centrion Dynamics. It meant nothing at first, until I remembered that my father had recently been tapped as a senior strategic advisor for a risk mitigation firm, his words. When I'd asked about it last Thanksgiving, he waved it off with a chuckle. Some bored hedge fund guys trying to look tough. They pay me to say no to dumb ideas. But Centrion Dynamics wasn't a joke. It was linked on record to 2 separate blacklisted vendors who'd been banned from U.S. contracts after a quiet inquiry into illegal arms brokerage back in 2017. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. My father had worked in private defense for years. He served in units where names changed, missions vanished, and reality was optional. It was entirely possible that his company had no idea who was feeding them capital. It was also possible he didn't want to know. But then I noticed things. His watch, always the same battered seal issue he wore for decades, was gone, replaced by a sleek foreign-looking chrono with Arabic numerals etched in platinum. A gift, he said, from a client in Doha. He had new meetings added to his calendar, names I didn't recognize, initials only. When I visited his place to drop off some old photographs my mother had left behind, I saw a notepad on his desk, written in Arabic, sloppy Arabic. Words scratched out and rewritten phonetically. My father didn't speak Arabic, never had. He'd always dismissed it as not the language of power. So why was he learning it now? One night I stayed longer than usual after a dinner we shared at his house, tense as always. I helped clear the dishes, poured myself a cup of tea, and walked out onto the back patio to breathe. That's when I heard him on the phone through the cracked kitchen window. He was trying to say something in Arabic, something that didn't make sense. Inta, nam, mashru, la takhaf, mumkin yahsabni wahda minhum. The rhythm was wrong, the inflection off. He was struggling, which meant he was practicing. Not performing, not mimicking, studying. And there was one phrase that jolted me. He might think I'm one of them. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, the cold ceramic cup pressed against my palm, until he ended the call and stepped outside. He didn't know I'd heard. He didn't even see me in the shadows. But I saw him. He looked tired. Not weak, but worn. as if he was holding something in place that wanted badly to collapse. We said goodnight. He hugged me. It was awkward but not unusual. That was our dynamic distance disguised as formality. But my instincts had kicked in. Not fear, pattern disruption. That's what we're trained to notice. Not what's loud, but what's off. A man who never cared about regional dialects now muttering his way through conjugations. A company that doesn't advertise suddenly added to sensitive financial flows. A SEAL commander who once said words don't win wars, now stumbling through them like a desperate cadet. Something was happening, and I was no longer sure if he was the player or the pawn. 2 days later, I accessed a restricted interagency brief through a joint task force channel I'd been granted access to during my Bahrain rotation. The report outlined several regional destabilization efforts, being amplified through anonymous information leaks, each tied to subtle narrative disruptions inside Western diplomatic circles. One of the patterns using trusted retired military officials to introduce controlled misinformation into briefings and advisory sessions. They weren't planting bombs. They were planting bias, not with lies, but with carefully framed truths. The kind of truths someone like my father could easily be convinced were patriotic, necessary, even noble. If someone wanted to manipulate a man like him, they'd know exactly which buttons to press. Pride, legacy, the need to stay relevant, especially after retirement, especially after his name stopped showing up in mission orders, especially after he realized that the daughter he once dismissed was now sitting in rooms he no longer had access to. I didn't want to believe it, but belief had nothing to do with it. I was staring at the alignment of signs, and every single one pointed to something I wasn't ready to face. My father, my mentor, my critic, my measure of success might be compromised. And worse, he might not even know it. Or he did, and didn't care. Either way, I had no choice. It was time to stop wondering, and start watching, carefully, quietly, like he'd taught me. Except this time, I was watching him. The invitation arrived in a thick cream envelope sealed with the golden crest of the Qatari embassy. My name was embossed in precise serif Commander Merriam Westfield. I ran my fingers over it twice, making sure it was real. Formal diplomatic invitations didn't come often, not even for someone in my position. And certainly not with a personal signature from the ambassador himself. The language was careful. In recognition of your contributions to strategic alliance operations and cultural diplomacy, you are cordially invited to an exclusive gala honoring U.S. Gulf cooperation. At first, I thought it was a recognition of quiet work. Finally, someone had noticed. I told myself it made sense. I'd recently completed a high-level mediation between 2 Gulf envoys over an oil rights dispute. I'd received a private commendation off the record, of course, for keeping it from erupting into a PR disaster. So when the gala invite came, it felt like a quiet nod from the world I'd served for 2 decades. Not a medal, not a headline, but a moment of acknowledgement. I said yes immediately. I even let myself imagine what it would feel like to walk into that ballroom dressed in a navy silk gown, shoes polished to a mirror shine, my hair swept up. Not for vanity, but for poise. To stand there, not as someone's daughter, not as just a translator, but as Commander Merriam Westfield, contributor to diplomacy, protector of peace. But I see it clearly now. That invitation wasn't a reward. It was a containment strategy. They didn't invite me because they valued my presence. They invited me so I wouldn't be absent. Because if I hadn't been there, I might have been somewhere else watching more closely. Because if I was in that room surrounded by crystal chandeliers and curated toasts, I'd be framed inside the picture, not behind the lens. And because if something went wrong, if someone collapsed, if the plan unraveled, I'd be too close, too emotionally compromised to see it for what it was. They counted on my loyalty. They counted on my silence. But they didn't count on how well I'd been trained to see things others miss. I was standing near the ambassador's table when I saw it. The switch. It took less than a second. One waiter stepping away, another stepping in. Subtle but not seamless. I noted the tremble in the hand, the brief pause between the replacement of the flutes, and something snapped awake inside me. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. That whisper in the bones that military linguists know better than anyone. This doesn't fit. I started walking before I knew I had moved. I drifted closer under the guise of small talk, angling myself toward the ambassador. He was smiling, preparing to raise the new glass. I whispered in Arabic, "Don't drink. Something's wrong," and he understood. He didn't flinch, he didn't speak. He simply adjusted his cufflink, an old signal, one I recognized from interagency training on Gulf region diplomatic tells. Then as I backed away, he drank it anyway. That was when I realized the game had started long before I arrived. The roles were cast, and I was supposed to be a non-speaking extra. I was never meant to see the switch. I was never meant to intervene. And if I'd been distracted, if I'd hesitated, then the narrative would have played out perfectly. A respected ambassador found dead at a high-profile event. Tragic, unfortunate, unavoidable, and I'd have stood silently, maybe even carrying part of the guilt, assuming there was nothing I could have done. Worse, I'd be cemented forever in my father's eyes as exactly what he always believed me to be. A daughter who observes but does not act. But I did act. And that changed everything. Because that whisper in Arabic, that single sentence, it pulled the curtain back on a performance I was never supposed to see. And when the ambassador collapsed, when glass shattered across the floor, when people screamed and cameras started rolling, I looked across the room. And my father was already watching me. His face didn't change. He didn't panic. He didn't rush forward. He just gave me a look. The same one he gave me when I was 8 and spilled water on his briefcase. The same one when I said I was enlisting. A look that said, "You've ruined something." But what I didn't have that answer yet. Not then. But the invitation, it wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about gratitude. It was about positioning. And I had just stepped outside of mine, which meant someone's plan, maybe even his, was about to fall apart. I didn't go home after the gala. I left the embassy in silence, slipped into a black SUV waiting just around the corner, and by 2:17 a.m., I was at an NCIS field facility downtown. There was no time for shock. No time for tears. No time to process that the man who smiled when a diplomat collapsed was the man who'd once taught me how to lace my boots. What I had now was evidence, and evidence needed motion. I activated the microphone embedded in my lapel and uploaded the footage to a secure server under Tier 4 protocol. The camera inside my blazer's decorative button had captured everything: the waiter swapped, the ambassador's hesitation, the drink, the collapse, the look on my father's face. It didn't show his smile, but it showed enough. I filed a rapid incident report, cross-referencing it with the alert logs from DIA, my original source. NCIS sent a liaison, and within hours, a CIA contact joined the conversation. No badges, just code names. We worked in silence, piecing together a trail of money, language, and movement. The first breadcrumb was financial. Through OFAC back channels, I pulled records of wire transfers tied to a shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands called Gulfline Stratsec. It had one U.S. affiliate, Westfield Global Security Consulting, my father's firm. There were irregular deposits, small split, always under $10,000 wired over 3 months, originating from Doha, Riyadh, and one odd case, Khartoum. And they weren't invoices. They were timed, aligned with minor regional events, pipeline inspections, ambassadorial visits, conference dinners. This wasn't just about personal gain. It was about placement. Someone was seeding influence across embassies, like someone planting fuses beneath a floor. The second breadcrumb was linguistic. In the audio from my button cam, I caught a quiet exchange between the waiter and another staffer by the dessert table. Arabic, but off. It sounded like Gulf dialect, Bahraini maybe. But the grammar was fractured, like someone memorizing phrases phonetically. I ran it through our linguistic pattern detection tool. The phrase al-fanajir mutaharaka, repeated twice, translates roughly to "the cups are in motion." But no native speaker would say it that way. It was like someone translating directly from English, not thinking in Arabic. Whoever orchestrated this didn't understand the language, but they were training others to fake it, which meant somewhere someone had created a linguistic front. And then there was the most troubling breadcrumb: the server. The waiter, Middle Eastern male, early 30s, beard trimmed precisely, wearing embassy-issued service credentials, was nowhere to be found. No biometric match, no staff file. His badge fake. He'd entered through the south delivery bay. Surveillance cut out for 5 minutes. Maintenance interference, they said. That wasn't a glitch. That was a hand over a lens. By daybreak, I sat in the Situation Room under a red tag clearance debriefing a joint task force. They didn't look surprised, just tired. One CIA official slid me a tablet. On it still from a drone shot 3 months prior in Basra, a training site with unidentified English-speaking men teaching Arabic with printed cue cards. One of them bore a resemblance to my father's head of operations. I looked up. "He's stateside now," I said. They nodded. And suddenly my father wasn't just involved. He was possibly a node in a system built to manipulate Gulf diplomacy through language misdirection, financial distortion, and weaponized access. And I was no longer a translator. I was a witness. There's a kind of stillness that comes after you realize someone you love might be part of something much darker than you ever imagined. But there's also clarity. Because now I knew this wasn't personal humiliation. This wasn't a father wounding his daughter at a gala. This was a network, and I'd just become the crack in its armor. My next move, not rage, not confrontation, documentation, precision. I compiled everything: the button cam footage, the audio files, a folder of linguistic anomalies, wire transfer timelines, an AI-generated model matching speech inconsistencies to suspect profiles. I encrypted it and sent it to a double-authenticated drop server air-gapped from both military and civilian systems. Because if something happened to me, they'd still have the truth. They'd still know who taught a retired admiral just enough Arabic to be dangerous, and they'd see what he smiled at. Wasn't the ambassador collapsing? It was the sound of a plan moving forward, except now I was moving faster. The phone rang at 6:12 p.m. I was at my desk in the NCIS safe house, light bleeding through the slats of the blinds. My fingers hovered over the encrypted files I'd compiled. Hundreds of pages, images, voice spectrograms, financial pathways. Everything pointed in one direction. I didn't recognize the number, but I didn't need to. I answered. There was no background noise, just a long pause, and then his voice. "Mariam," one word, not a demand, not a reprimand, just a name. He never called me just to talk. Not since I was 16. Not since I chose Arabic over Annapolis. I waited. He said calmly, "What are you working on?" His tone wasn't warm. It wasn't cold either. It was too neutral, too precise. The way someone speaks when they're choosing every syllable like a chess move. I looked at the screen in front of me, the tab that read Operation Whispergate, the folder with metadata tagged to Gulfline StratSec, the one with timestamps of his overseas visits, matched against sudden embassy leaks. I replied without hesitation. "I'm finishing what you left undone." A pause. "I'm protecting what we swore to defend." The honor of the uniform, silence. I thought I heard a sharp exhale, like he might speak. But he didn't, so I ended it. "I hope that still means something to you." Click. I sat still. My hand resting on the phone, the air dense with the unsaid. That wasn't just a father checking in. That was a man who knew. He knew I had seen the cracks. He knew I was close. He knew I wasn't going to stop. And yet, he didn't threaten me. No accusations, no denial, no anger. Just that question. What are you working on? The kind of question you ask someone when you already know the answer and are just measuring how much they're willing to say. But more than that, it was a test. To see if I would flinch. To see if I would lie. To see if I would betray him out of rage. Or stay silent out of fear. I gave him neither. After I hung up, I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. A blank report memo to be filed under Joint Military Counterinfluence. I had been drafting it for hours, struggling to define the enemy without using his name. But now I typed it plainly. Suspected internal compromise, tied to former Rear Admiral Ronald Westfield. I saved it. Then I opened the encrypted satellite schedule. There was a Gulfline charter flight due to depart from Dulles in 48 hours. Destination Zurich, then Amman. The passenger manifest was redacted. But the alias was one I recognized. A call sign he used years ago in a covert op briefing. He wasn't just waiting to be discovered. He was preparing to disappear. I leaned back and closed my eyes. This was the moment I had feared all my life. Not the fall of a father, but the realization that the man I had revered, who taught me honor, who stood at my promotion to commander, who ran drills with me in our backyard shouting Navy cadence, had become a ghost inside a system I was trained to detect. And still, I didn't hate him. That was the worst part. I still wanted to believe he was trying to protect something, that somewhere behind the alliances and shell companies and misused Arabic phrases, there was a reason, a calculation, a purpose I didn't yet see. But I couldn't let that blind me. Truth wasn't a family heirloom you protected with silence. Truth was duty. And in that moment, I felt a calm resolve settle into my bones. Because I wasn't chasing vengeance. I wasn't trying to disgrace him. I was following the trail he had once told me to never ignore. When something doesn't make sense, follow the contradiction. I was following it. And it had led me to his doorstep. The next morning, I filed the memo. I sent a copy to Joint Command and a redacted one to the Oversight Committee. I signed it. Commander Merriam Westfield, U.S. Navy, Strategic Language Operations. Then I locked the door, walked outside, and stared at the fading winter sky. Somewhere he was already on the move, but he knew now I wasn't looking the other way. I wasn't the quiet daughter in the corner. I was the one who understood what he said in Arabic and what he didn't say at all. And he knew I was getting closer. 3 days later, my father was summoned. The official term was closed-door inquiry before the Defense Intelligence Subcommittee, but everyone in the hallway just called it what it was, a reckoning. I sat in a waiting room just off the west wing of the Capitol Fingers, wrapped around a manila folder. It was heavier than it looked. Inside were 172 pages documentation I had compiled, with a clinical precision I didn't know I was capable of. Redacted satellite logs, bank records translated from Arabic, export documents disguised under humanitarian labels. And then, the audio, 6 separate recordings, 2 voices in Arabic, one of them distorted, the other recognizable only because I had lived in its echo my entire life. Rear Admiral Ronald Westfield, my father. The man who once barked orders over the Pacific, now sat behind a reinforced wooden desk, under oath, flanked by a government lawyer with a jaw so tight it looked wired shut. They didn't allow cameras, no press, no public gallery, just a handful of senior staffers, military legal counsel, and 1 linguistics officer, me. I wasn't required to testify, but they asked if I would, and I said yes, not out of vengeance. Not to humiliate, but because I had always been trained to serve without fear. And this was the one battlefield where silence would be surrender. They called my name. I stood. The folder was steady in my hands, but something deep inside me was not. It wasn't nerves, it wasn't shame, it was mourning. Not for a man who had died, but for a man who had stopped being who I thought he was. As I entered the room, I saw him. His dress uniform was impeccable, medals arranged precisely, back straight, jawline firm. But he looked smaller than I remembered, still powerful but isolated. He didn't nod, didn't flinch, just stared ahead, eyes fixed on the oak wall like it might answer for him. The chair creaked slightly as I sat down across from the committee. Commander Westfield, one of the congressional aides, said, "You've submitted a supplemental file in advance of your appearance today." "Yes," I replied, "including translations, verified metadata, and corroborated surveillance logs." "And your source for this data?" I paused carefully. "Joint collaboration between Naval Intelligence DIA and Strategic Language Ops. And your connection to the subject under inquiry." "My father," I said, voice steady. "Retired Rear Admiral Ronald Westfield." That was the moment I felt every eye in the room shift just slightly toward him. He didn't blink. They asked about the emails first, then the wire transfers, one of which routed through a shell company tied to a contractor he'd advised after retirement. They asked about the calls in Arabic. I pulled out a printout. "In this call, sir," the second voice instructs Admiral Westfield to confirm delivery of a security override, specifically using the phrase al-tabt al-mafta, which means the open lock. That is not a common phrase in Levantine dialect. It is a code used in covert asset tracking in the Jordanian intel network. A pause. One of the officers shifted in his chair. "Do you believe your father knew the context of what he was involved in?" I took a breath. I believe he thought he was serving a higher strategy. I believe he was manipulated. But I also believe he chose not to ask questions that would have made the truth unavoidable. Silence. Someone cleared their throat. "Commander, are you aware of the gravity of what you're implying here?" "Yes," I said. I'm also aware of the gravity of silence. I set the folder down. Inside was a burned disc. The final audio clip. You'll hear the phrase at timestamp 02:14. He repeats it, twice, in perfect rhythm. Not like someone guessing, like someone trained. I didn't need to look up to feel his eyes finally turn toward me, not as a father, not as an officer, but as a man who finally understood I hadn't come to destroy him. I had come to speak the truth even if it cut both ways. They thanked me, dismissed me. I stood slowly, and just as I turned to leave, I heard one of the aides mutter under his breath, "That's the girl he said would never matter." I kept walking. Outside the corridor was quiet. Muted lighting, no foot traffic. And for the first time in years, I felt my name Miriam Westfield not as a shadow under his, but as a weight I had chosen to carry and make real. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because truth, however painful, is the one thing no uniform can outrank. I walked into the hearing room again, not as a witness this time, not to speak, just to deliver the final file. The lighting was still dim, the air sharp with the scent of paper suit fabric and cooled ambition. No one greeted me, no one needed to. They had seen the file I submitted, and now they waited for him. My father sat at the same table, his posture straight, hands clasped together on the polished wood. He looked up. No anger, no warmth, just silence. The kind of silence that builds when two people have said too much and not enough all at once. I didn't rush, didn't hesitate either. My boots made a soft, measured sound as I crossed the room and placed the file on the table in front of him. Not thrown, not pushed, just placed. He stared at it, didn't touch it. I lingered, not for effect, but because I needed this moment to land. I took a breath, bent slightly closer. My voice was low but deliberate. "I don't need you to be proud." I paused. "Let the words live in the air. I just need you to stop." The silence tightened. For a fraction of a second, I thought he might speak. Might argue, justify, or maybe deny. But he didn't. His right hand trembled. Just barely, a small flicker. But I saw it. And for me that was enough. Because there are wounds in this life that no apology can dress. And there are fathers who believe strength is louder than truth. He had raised me to be steel, to bend without breaking. But he had never once looked to see if I bled in the process. Now he saw. He didn't meet my eyes again. But his breathing changed, slower, heavier. I turned to leave. Behind me, a congressional aide whispered something about precedent and retired immunity, but I didn't listen. I had said all I came to say. And he had heard it. I stepped out into the hallway where the buzz of conversation resumed. People passed by unaware that inside that room a man's legacy was unraveling. Not just by evidence, but by the one voice he could never quite silence mine. I remember when I was 12. I brought home a certificate from school Arabic poetry translation. I had worked on it for weeks. My teacher said it was the best she'd seen. I gave it to him at dinner. He glanced at it, said pretty words don't win wars. That was all. I learned early not to seek applause. But standing here now, I realized I also learned not to ask him to stop. Until today. And now that I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel guilt. I felt peace. Peace isn't always born of justice. Sometimes it's born of release. Of letting go of the version of someone you kept hoping would appear. I walked to the window, watching the late sun paint the Capitol's white stone gold. A junior officer passed by and nodded at me just enough respect to say he recognized the name, or maybe the silence I had held in that room. And I realized, maybe I hadn't just stopped him, maybe I had freed myself. For the first time, my name stood alone, not as a shadow, not as an echo. Miriam Westfield. Commander, linguist, officer, daughter. And that last title, it no longer stung. Because I had spoken what needed to be said. Not in anger, not in rage, but in truth. A truth I could finally live with. And one I hoped he would too, even if he never said it out loud. Especially if he didn't. By the time the sun rose over D.C., the next morning my name had already circled the globe. Headlines spun out faster than I could refresh my screen. Rear Admiral's daughter topples operation from within the woman, who whispered at the Gala commander Westfield patriot or betrayer. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't return calls from Navy PR. I didn't check the messages from old classmates or reporters or extended family. I turned off every notification, left my phone on the dresser, and took a long walk down Rock Creek Park, wearing my old navy sweatshirt and plain sneakers. No one recognized me. Or maybe they did and decided to let me have this silence. I listened to the sound of leaves brushing the ground as joggers passed me. A mother lifted her toddler from a stroller. The baby pointed at a squirrel. A man with a veteran's cap nodded politely. No cameras, no questions. Just breath and pavement and the faint chill of morning. Somewhere on the other side of the country, I imagined my father sitting in his den, the television on mute, watching the coverage unfold. The images replaying over and over the moment I set the file down in front of him. The brief exchange of words between us, the military tribunal's statement that followed. The media didn't know what to do with us. We didn't fit their binary. Not villain and hero. Not clean betrayal or triumphant loyalty. Some anchors called me the dagger behind the stars. Others painted me as a resentful daughter lashing out for attention. One op-ed asked would she have done it if it were her mother. And then there were the forums, the veterans boards, the Reddit threads, the military wives' Facebook groups. Each had its own version of the truth. Some called me a disgrace to my uniform. Others said I had done what too many men lacked the courage to do: expose rot from within. The part that stuck with me came from a quiet post on a Navy spouse blog. We trained to fight enemies overseas. But sometimes the real war is in the silence we grow up with. That one sentence nearly stopped me cold. Because yes, that was the war I had fought longest. Not in Syria, not in Riyadh. Not in an embassy basement translating intercepted calls under flickering lights. But in my own kitchen growing up, where my father would speak of valor and discipline over breakfast, but never ask how my day had been. Where praise was rationed like combat rations, scarce, utilitarian, and never for show. I kept walking. Across the bridge I could see a group of reporters outside the Navy Yard gate, talking into mics, speculating on what the tribunal would decide. Whether he'd lose his pension, whether I would be promoted, or quietly reassigned. I kept walking. At a coffee cart, a young soldier held the door open for me. He didn't flinch. He didn't say anything. But I noticed the faint nod, just enough to register that he knew, or guessed, or maybe just respected silence. I took my coffee and sat on a bench. No camera, no email. Just the warm weight of the cup in my hands. I thought of the other people whose stories didn't get told. The intelligence officer who flagged the encrypted phrase weeks ago. The translator in Qatar who passed along the altered phrase patterns. The Marine who spotted the waiter disappearing too fast. This wasn't just my story, but because my last name was Westfield. Because I was the one who whispered in Arabic at the Gala. Because I was the one who turned a father into a headline. It had become mine. I didn't ask for that, but I would carry it. And while the world argued over whether I had betrayed a hero or revealed a coward, I chose to let them argue, because I didn't do this to win the court of public opinion. I did this because soldiers trust the chain of command. And when that chain rusts, someone has to name it out loud. Even if that someone shares the rusted name. Even if it hurts, especially if it hurts. I finished my coffee, looked out at the water, breathed in the morning as it was not as a symbol, not as a scandal, but as mine. And I stood up, not to fight, not to explain, just to keep walking forward. 1 week after the tribunal, a sealed envelope arrived at my apartment in Arlington. No courier, no warning. Just a simple white envelope with the Department of Defense seal and my name typed in the center, Lieutenant Commander Miriam Westfield. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, the kind reserved for formal commendations or censures. My hands didn't shake, but my breath paused just slightly. Your actions, though no weapon was drawn, no bullet fired, prevented a diplomatic rupture with consequences, far beyond one night or one name. We commend your discretion, your intelligence, and your loyalty to the values this uniform represents. It was signed by the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I folded the letter gently and placed it on the coffee table beside an old photo frame I hadn't touched in years. The picture inside was from when I was 7. In it, I wore an oversized Navy SEAL t-shirt tucked into jeans, a toy beret sliding off my head. My father stood next to me, not smiling, but solid the way mountains don't need to prove their presence. It was taken at his graduation from Bud S. My mother had placed my hand in his for the shot. I remembered that day vividly. The smell of salt and brass, the way everyone cheered, the way I thought I want to be just like him. For most of my life, I chased that shadow. I joined Navy ROTC when I was 17 over his objections. Majored in Middle Eastern languages, even when he said it was soft intel. Trained in field ops, even when he told me I should stay behind a desk. And for years, I still looked to him the way children look at lighthouses, as if they could steer me clear just by standing tall. But legacies aren't made in bronze plaques or old uniforms. They are forged quietly in what we choose to break and what we choose to build. My father spent his career tearing down enemies. I'd spent mine decoding conversations. He had scars on his arms. I had annotations in the margins of classified files. He spoke with command. I spoke in whispers. And yet here we were, two sides of the same oath. One of us used it to conceal, the other to reveal. That photo on my table used to make me ache. Now I saw it differently. He had been a giant in my eyes, but sometimes giants don't protect the village. They step on it. And daughters grow up not to follow in those footsteps, but to redirect the path entirely. I picked up the photo, studied our faces side by side. He resolute, me reaching. Back then I wanted to become him. Now I understood I grew up to stop the damage he couldn't see he was causing. I didn't do it to shame him. I didn't do it out of vengeance. I did it because legacy isn't inherited, it's chosen. And sometimes it's rewritten not with medals or speeches, but with a truth said out loud when no one else dares. Later that night, I placed the letter in a file marked internal commendations. And the photo, I didn't hide it, but I did move it. From the shelf above my desk to a drawer, not erased, just repositioned. That's what daughters do when they outgrow the stories they were told. They make room for their own. I walked to the window and looked out across the quiet street. No protesters, no headlines, no more calls. Just the hum of a city that keeps going, oblivious to the wars we fight within our own homes, our own hearts. Tomorrow I would go back to my post. I'd meet with the DIA for follow-ups. I'd review files, rewrite assessments, sign off on field clearance reports. And I'd do it with the same steady resolve, not because I was trying to live up to a name, but because I was building my own. This is how legacies shift, not in fire, but in quiet correction, one daughter at a time. My father never went to prison. The agencies called it a closed inquiry. His clearance was stripped, his consulting firm dissolved. And though no formal charges were filed, he was quietly removed from every defense contract he'd ever touched. Just like that, the man who once advised Joint Special Operations Command was no longer welcome in any room where policy was discussed or decisions were made. I didn't celebrate. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely looks like triumph. I heard from a colleague in the Pentagon that he'd sold the Arlington condo, the one overlooking the Potomac, where he used to polish his boots even after retiring, and relocated to Idaho. A farm, apparently. Chickens, fencing, some kind of cattle. I tried to picture him there, trading tactical gear for flannel, using a weather app instead of field intelligence, saying sunrise instead of situation report. It was easier than I thought. Maybe because in some way I'd already started to let go. I didn't check up on him. I didn't dig. I didn't want to know if he still wore his medals or if he'd boxed them up. Then one Friday afternoon, a month after the tribunal, I found a letter on my doorstep. It was handwritten, my name in cursive across the front, Miriam, no return address. No stamps, no military markings. Just plain white paper folded into thirds, placed in an unsealed envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My father had taught me block lettering when I was 6, said it helped eliminate hesitation. But he only wrote in cursive when it was personal. I didn't open it. I didn't tear it up either. I placed it on my bookshelf, between an old field manual I used to study for language immersion and a slim paperback titled The Art of Listening Under Pressure. And there it has stayed. Weeks passed, then months. I dust around it every Sunday, but I haven't broken the seal. Not because I'm angry, not anymore, but because there are wounds that don't flare with pain, they echo with silence. There's a temptation to believe forgiveness is a light switch, that it happens in a moment triggered by an apology or a gesture. But for me, forgiveness is a process, a room I haven't walked into yet, a voice I haven't found the right tone to answer with, I wonder sometimes what the letter says. Is it a confession? A defense A-list of justifications dressed in fatherly concern? Or is it simple 3 words? I was wrong. Even that I don't know if I'm ready to read. Because to read it means to confront not just him, but myself. To ask, did I ever need his approval? Did I spend too long trying to earn it? And now that I've acted against him, is that absence of pride something I still carry? I once believed that exposure, the truth laid bare, was enough. But sometimes it leaves both parties staring at a scar, unsure whether it's healing or just hiding. At night, I sometimes catch myself looking toward the bookshelf, and I think of him waking up in Idaho. Maybe he walks with a cane now, or maybe he's stronger than ever. Maybe he's built a fence that keeps the world out. Or maybe for the first time, he's learned to sit still. People talk about closure like it's a door you shut. But for me, it's a space you preserve not out of bitterness, but out of boundaries. That letter still unopened isn't a symbol of hate. It's a placeholder, a marker that says, I'm not ready. But maybe someday, maybe on a rainy day, I'll boil water for tea and sit by the window, and I'll finally slide my finger under the fold. Read each word slowly, like decoding a foreign language I used to know. Maybe, but not today. Today I lace up my boots, I zip up my uniform, I check my email. I brief junior officers, I finish reports, I serve. Not because I'm trying to outrun the past, but because I've accepted it won't ever change. And yet I still believe people can. Even men like my father, especially daughters like me. I leave the envelope where it is, between knowledge and understanding, between code and translation, between the person I once tried to impress and the woman I've become without needing to. Forgiveness isn't a gift you hand out before it's ready. It's earned in time, in quiet, in the slow shift between remembering and releasing. And when the day comes, when I finally open that letter, I hope I find not just his truth, but mine. I still work in the shadows. Another negotiation, another map, another coded voice on the line. Still Arabic, still earpieces, still the rhythm of soft syllables whispered behind closed doors. But something's shifted. The silence I used to resent has become a place I inhabit by choice, because I've come to understand its power. I no longer whisper because I have to. I whisper because sometimes a quiet word at the right time can save more than a life. It can save what's left of our humanity. 2 months after the hearing, I was asked to assist with a high-stakes deconfliction effort in the Gulf. A rogue drone strike had missed its intended target, landed too close to a protected medical zone. Tensions soared. Every side blamed the other. One spark, and we'd lose what little trust remained. They called me in not because I carried rank, but because I carried the nuance. I knew the dialect. I recognized the tone under the tone. I could hear what wasn't said. In a small beige conference room in Stuttgart, I sat at a round table with military attachés and legal advisors, a translator on each side. The mood was brittle like the air before a sandstorm. Everyone spoke English, but no one was truly listening. Then I leaned in, switched channels, and whispered something in Arabic. Just a phrase. Nothing more than a proverb my grandmother used to say, words spoken in anger build walls. Words spoken in calm build bridges. The Jordanian colonel on the other end of the call went still. He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice had softened. We finished the call without shouting. No fists slammed the table, no boots deployed. And the air for the first time in weeks felt breathable again. That day I didn't wear a uniform. I didn't flash credentials. I just whispered. And I remembered what that used to feel like when I was a child, learning to interpret with my father's voice in my ear, telling me precision saves lives. Back then I thought he meant enemy positions and laser designators. Now I know he meant something deeper. A whisper can be precise. A whisper can cut through pride. A whisper can carry more weight than a shout if spoken at the right moment. After the meeting, I went back to my temporary quarters, kicked off my boots, and opened my journal. Not to write about my father, not to tally wounds, but to remind myself why I stay. In this world of noise and posturing, of medals and secrets, I've found that stillness is where I'm strongest. Not because I lack volume, but because I've learned to use my voice in ways that matter. Sometimes that voice testifies before a tribunal. Sometimes it deciphers encrypted chatter. Sometimes it's a whisper into a headset echoing across continents. And sometimes it's a quiet sentence to a frightened interpreter sitting beside me reminding them they're not alone. That's how we survive this work. Not by yelling the loudest, but by learning when to lower our voices and speak with intent. I've kept the same headset since Qatar. The same mic, same switch. I've replaced the foam once or twice. But the core is the same. I guess I like the continuity. The reminder that tools don't fail, people do. When I put it on, I feel the weight of every word I carry. My father used to say language was a weapon. I disagree. Language is a lifeline. It's a rope we toss across divides we're too proud to cross otherwise. And when used with care, it doesn't destroy. It builds. These days, I rarely appear in photos. I'm not the one giving statements or standing on podiums. I sit in the third row. I walk behind convoys. I enter briefing rooms through side doors. But my words still move. Sometimes they're the reason a convoy reroutes. Sometimes they're the reason a mother gets a phone call instead of a folded flag. And that's enough. It's strange how something so quiet can carry so much weight. How a girl once dismissed as just a translator became the hinge of an operation, the difference between conflict and understanding. I no longer crave my father's recognition. Not because I've stopped caring, but because I've started defining myself on my own terms. He chose silence to control. I choose silence to connect. That's the difference. That's the redemption. And when I whisper now, it's not to hide. It's to heal. It's to remind the world that dignity doesn't need a microphone and truth doesn't always arrive with applause. I'm still here, still whispering, still fighting for the kind of peace that doesn't show up in headlines, but changes everything. And if that's all I ever do, it will be enough. I didn't win against my father. I didn't need to. This was never about victory, never about proving him wrong in front of a tribunal or a camera or a nation. It was about being seen. Not as his echo, not as his proxy, not as the quiet shadow standing behind a larger-than-life name, but as myself, as a human being, as a soldier of a different kind, as a woman who could hear danger before it spoke and whisper back with something stronger than fear. The truth is, I spent most of my life trying to earn a man's pride, who never learned how to show it. He handed me silence when I needed guidance, dismissal when I needed belief, and the weight of legacy when I was too young to even carry my own voice. And maybe you know that weight. Maybe someone watching this right now is still carrying it worse, believing it's their fault. Maybe you were told you're too soft, too loud, too slow, too much. Maybe you've been measured against a parent's mirror and told you'd never reflect enough. If that's you, hear me. You don't need them to be proud of you. You just need them to stop standing in your light. That's what I wanted. Not applause, not medals, not even closure, just space. Space to live a life of my own design. To make peace in the way I understood it. To whisper not because I was forced to, but because it worked. I never wanted revenge, not truly. Revenge rots what it touches. What I wanted was a reckoning, a stop. Not for his sake, but for mine. And I got it. The day I placed that file on the table, looked into his eyes and said, I don't need you to be proud. I just need you to stop. Something inside me settled. Not because he answered. He didn't. But because I no longer needed him to. You see, dignity isn't granted by others. It's claimed. Quietly, firmly. Not in triumph, but in truth. I walk forward now without that shadow behind me. I still carry his name, but no longer his silence. I still remember his lessons, but choose my own limits. And if I ever have a daughter, I will never make her earn her voice. I'll teach her to whisper when she must and roar when she chooses. Not for me. Not to prove anything, but because she can. So if you're watching this and you've been dismissed, minimized, erased by someone who should have seen you, I want you to know your worth is not in their recognition. Your strength is not in their permission. Your life is not a stage for their redemption arc. You're allowed to outgrow their silence. You're allowed to redefine legacy. You're allowed to be seen even if they never look. I didn't win against my father, but I stood. I stayed. I whispered when it mattered. And I walked away with my soul intact. Sometimes that's the victory that matters most. I no longer dream of becoming someone great. That dream belonged to the girl in the old photograph, the one in the tiny uniform costume looking up at her father like he carved the stars himself. That girl believed greatness looked like medals, missions, and salutes. Now I just want to live right and speak when it counts. I want to choose stillness over spectacle, substance over noise, because justice, it doesn't always walk in with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in the hush of a room when one woman stands still and speaks the native tongue of a man ready to make a fatal mistake. It doesn't take power to stop a war. It takes presence. A presence that listens. A presence that translates silence. A presence that knows when to whisper and when to let silence speak louder. People assume justice must be loud to be real, that it needs fist microphones or viral headlines. But I've learned the most necessary truths are often the quietest. I don't want to fight for a place in someone else's story anymore. I want to tell my own with nuance, with restraint, with dignity. I don't need the room to clap. I just need the right people to understand. Or even just one. The world we live in is loud. Anger wins views. Extremes win votes. But somewhere underneath all that, the real work gets done by people who don't raise their voices. They raise standards. They raise truths. They raise others. So if you're watching this and you've ever been overlooked, if you've been told your quiet doesn't matter or your language isn't the right one, remember, you don't have to shout. You just have to whisper at the right moment, because the right whisper in the right ear at the right time can save a life, or a city, or a soul. That's what I carry now. Not vengeance, not validation. Just a quiet certainty that I stood where I had to and spoke when it mattered. I forgave him in my own way by choosing not to become him, by choosing not to let bitterness rewrite my blood. And in a strange way, I'm grateful. Grateful that his silence taught me to find my own voice. Grateful that his shadow helped me define my own shape. So I don't need the dream anymore. I don't need to be great. I just want to be good to myself, to the world, to the next person who might one day stand where I stood. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.